I got a feeling deep inside.
Hello. Welcome to our live stream. Divorce is not a bad word, where Nikita and I will discuss all things related to divorce and finance. My name is Terry Ho. I am a certified financial analyst, CDFA for short. I help individuals and their families navigate the financial aspects of divorce by assessing financial risks, analyzing/evaluating various financial considerations of a settlement proposal, but most importantly, help the client establish realistic budgets and plan for their financial future after divorce. On the screen is my partner in crime for the stream, Nikita Lamar of Lamar Legal Group. She is a family attorney based in the great state of Texas.
Hi, how are you today? I'm happy to be here. My name is Nikita Lamar, and I am the owner and managing attorney of Lamar Legal Group, PLLC. And I have been practicing in the area of family law for, it will be 9 years in November. So seen a lot, and just happy to be able to be in a space where I can share the information in this way. So thank you for having me as a co-host.
So before we introduce the topic for episode 4, Nikita, why don't we recap the topics we've discussed so far in our past episodes for those who recently joined us? So
Sure.
we've gone through 4 episodes already with a lot of great information. Episode 1, we discussed Divorce 101, the process of divorce in the great state of Texas. Episode 2, we cover the different routes that you can take your divorce and the costs associated with the process. Episode 3, Nikita and I had is actually one of our favorites. We had a guest speaker, Brian Goonan, a licensed psychologist, give us insight on how our mindset can affect the cost of divorce. And now for our new episode, drum roll please, Nikita. Nikita and I believe that property division is a huge topic, and we will need more than just one episode around this topic. We will have a series of episodes around untangling the knot, navigating property division in Texas. On this episode, we will discuss the difference between community property versus equitable distribution states and why it is important to know which state you are in for your divorce. Whew, I can't believe we're already on episode 4, Nikita.
Yeah.
Giving out a lot of good stuff. You've been sharing so much insight, but I think this topic is huge because when it comes to your divorce, I mean, depending on what state you're in, it really depends how you divide your assets, right?
Very true. When we talk about community property versus equitable distribution states, it is very important to know before you get married, actually, what state you're in and what that state subscribes to and what that means, as it relates to property that you already have versus property that you're going to acquire during your marriage.
Very, very true. And when you say that, tell us a little bit. So, what is the difference? What property states versus the equitable distribution states? What
So
makes each
in
other?
community property states, the intent is to split property obtained during the marriage equally. In equitable distribution states, a court will divide marital property in the manner in which it considers fair, but it may not necessarily be equal to each party. So that's a roundabout way of describing things. Also, in community property states, it's automatically assumed that everything that's accumulated during marriage is community property. And, as the person who would be claiming something as separate, they have the onus to show that the onus is on them to show that whatever it is that they're contesting as being, their separate property. Why is that so? How is it so? And we talk about some exclusions to those rules a little bit later on in this discussion, but essentially those are the differences.
So my question to you is, when you say you have community and then you have the equitable distribution states. So in community, what if, let's say, your name is not on the mortgage or the deed of the house, or, and then, does that still consider a part of the community property?
It absolutely is, especially if you're somewhere like Texas and they're a community property state. Remember, I said the assumption is that anything that's acquired during the marriage is considered community property, whether or not the spouse's name is on it. So a lot of times people do think that they're going to get away with saying that this is my separate property because they only have their name on the mortgage, or their only, their name is the only name that's on the deed. Not so. It's about when that particular piece of property was acquired. And, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's essentially how it goes, So a lot of times people think that because names aren't on things, just like bank accounts, that it's safe. And that's not necessarily true.
In the community property states. And
Right.
Nikita's right. So Texas is a community property states, and there are about only 8 states that are community property. Everybody else is equitable distribution. Am I right, Nikita?
Yeah, but I think that the misnomer is that there's a safe space to be in, and that it's worse to be in a community property state, and that's not necessarily the truth. It's really about the facts of those divorces. That's what's going to make the difference. And so just because you don't have someone automatically assuming that it's community property doesn't mean that in the equitable distribution states that spouse will not be entitled to something as it relates to that separate property.
Okay. So now we talk about the community property versus separate property. Community property, also AKA marital property. So Nikita, explain to us like what is considered marital property and what's considered separate property.
Well, okay, so we say community property. I think a lot of times people get tripped up with the marital, but we say community property versus separate property. Community property includes things like earned income from either spouse during the marriage. So what you're going to be earning, and that could be as an entrepreneur or as someone who is employed. Dividends, interest, capital gains, on any part of the community estate, dividends and interest earned on a spouse's separate property during the marriage. Remember, I said just because something is separate property doesn't mean that the other spouse is not going to be entitled to something. You could still have separate property, but another spouse can be entitled to some type of distribution from that separate property. Property purchased with the income earned during the marriage, that's considered community property as well. Separate property includes capital gains on separate property, and that's why it's so important to make sure that we know, what the separate property is, and that you keep it as separate and you're not commingling those things. That's another thing. Any gifts and inheritances that are received by either spouse during the marriage, and that includes joint gifts. So say, for instance, after you get married, someone gifts the bride $10,000 and gifts the groom $10,000, or the bride and the groom and the groom, then that is their separate property individually.
And when you talk about keeping it like separate, what did you go back to that and kind of give us an example? What do you mean? How do you keep it separate?
So it's important that people don't commingle separate property with their community property, because there's a presumption in Texas that property that you possess during the marriage is community. That's the assumption. So any spouse that's claiming that they're separate property, they have the burden of proving that. And because of that, you don't want to commingle your separate property with your community property. And I'll give you an example. Say, for instance, you have a home before the marriage, and then you guys live in the home, and then you start allowing your spouse to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on renovations. Well, then that's the presumption that you're not intending that to be separate property. You're having this person to invest a lot of money into this separate property. So the presumption can then be turned around that is considered community property. And I've seen that happen before. So the commingling, you want to make sure that it is your intention, and that it remains your intention throughout, that this separate property is aside from anything that you accumulate during the marriage. And ways to do that is making sure that if you're paying things, that you're paying it out of a particular account that's only yours, that you saying, okay, well, this is what comes out for this separate property. It means that if you get an inheritance, that you don't if it's money, you don't place the check into your joint account and then you guys are using that inheritance together. Then it's the presumption, right, of the other party that you intend for this to be community property. So you just want to make sure that it's a lot of different ways that people can commingle, and we can't go through all of them, but those are some ideas as to how you can make sure that the separate and the community property stays that way.
Absolutely. And so as far as Nikita gave us like high level of what community property is versus separate property. I think this is the part where it's like a juicier portion of our episode, like what type of assets qualify under separate property. And then the other thing is, how do individuals protect certain assets from being a part of the marital property? And one of the things that she mentioned was gifting and inheritance. Like, how do we keep that separate? So Nikita, the importance of understanding the distinction for protecting gifted inheritance. Like you said, you mentioned not commingling it. What does that mean? Let's say I got inherited money, okay, before I got married. What do I need to do to make sure? And I know you said a little bit about it again, but how do I keep that money from being commingled in the actual community?
Well, it's a couple of ways. I would say anyone coming into a situation like a marriage that has some assets, you want to consider heavily a prenuptial agreement. That's the number one way for you to make sure, if you have property of any kind, if you have investments of any kind, if you have a business that you do not intend your spouse to be a part of, then you want to make sure that you speak with them about it. Say, hey, I think that that's the best thing for both of us. Especially if you're evenly yoked, meaning that you both have things that you're coming into a marriage with, then I would definitely recommend a prenuptial agreement that delineates what you're saying is separate property. You both sign off on it. You are giving them assurances that this is what I own. I'm not keeping anything from you. So that is really the number one way, along with making sure that you have estate plans in place, of course, before marriage and, after marriage, and then, during marriage and then after marriage, making sure that you make the necessary changes to those documents. But those are two surefire ways. There can always be challenges and things like that, but those are really rock solid ways to make sure that you keep those things, separate, and that somebody is signing off on the fact that you have told them and they agree to this distinction.
And the crazy thing is, like you said, the word prenuptial, and from my experience, whenever they hear either side, spouse, women or men, prenuptial, they're like, oh my gosh, that's such a bad word. But what is your opinion on prenuptials? Why is it important?
Well, the thing about it is like I tell a lot of people when it comes to that, we pay for different types of insurances and we don't think twice about it. And we hope that those things don't happen, right? You hope you're never in a fire. You hope you're never in a flood. You hope you're never in an accident. You hope you never need to go to the hospital for anything. But we don't have an issue paying for these things. But when it comes to the relationships and love, and we want to place something different on that. But it's a way to have insurance, essentially. And so, being able to have that conversation with the person that you're supposed to spend the rest of your life with, the ability to or not to is something that you should definitely take into consideration.
So I agree with what you're saying. And I think what it is the more education part. People think that prenuptial means, oh no, they're trying to keep everything for me. If I get a divorce, I get nothing. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because both parties can set the parameters of what they're looking for and want in the prenup, correct?
And I'm going to tell you, and this is from experience. I've been drafting and looking over prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements for about 9 years now. And most of the ones that I have seen, if not all, I don't like saying all because I'm an attorney, but most of the ones that I have looked over and have drafted, they are extremely amicable and fair and equitable. And that is the best time to address those types of things. Why? Because of the mindset that you're in. You love the person. You want the best for them. You want the best for them, even if something doesn't happen right now. But after everything happens and you're in the space of divorce, sometimes you're not thinking in the way that you were then, right?
Absolutely.
And so it may not be beneficial to either side the way that we're feeling at that time. So I tell people, not only is it an insurance policy, but it's also an expression of love, because you don't know what space you're going to be in, if something happens. And so it saves a lot of time. And, I'm going to tell you this. A lot of people wonder why some of these celebrities get divorced so fast and they are able to come to terms so quickly. Now, that's not everybody, but a lot of them. Sometimes you'll pop up and you're like, I didn't even know they were divorced. Absolutely, because they have things to lose. And so because they have things to lose, they go the amicable route, or they've already set up a pre or postnuptial agreement. So I'm in favor of them, when it works for individuals. And I think that especially the way that the marriages are now, people are coming together evenly yoked. They're even playing fields. So it's just a smart thing to invest in.
So tell me about this. So you have the prenuptial and then you have a postnuptial.
Mhm.
When do you use either or, and when does it come into play, and what's the difference?
Pre is before marriage, post is after marriage. So, you essentially have a second bite at the apple. Some people, they don't want to have the conversation, or, they may have gotten married a while back, and it wasn't a big deal because they both came in with not having much. And then later on, they started acquiring things. And they're like, wow, if something happens, then we need to address it. Well, that's where the postnuptial agreement comes in.
I see.
Mhm.
Do you feel like it's a little harder to get someone to do the postnuptial versus the prenuptial, or they have kind of equal weight?
Really, I mean, I can't say for sure, but what I can say is that, sometimes those conversations aren't easy either way. But, if things are coming at you fast and you guys are building an empire, it may not be such a weird thing to say, listen, we didn't account for all of this happening. We didn't know we were going to go into business together. We didn't know we were going to amass, so much. So we need to think about, well, what happens if something should happen? So it really is an individual kind of conversation, and it's fact specific. Yeah.
So you said that, in order, so yes, prenuptial, postnuptial, let's say they don't even do that. Okay.
Mhm.
Let's say they get the inheritance and it's prior to their marriage or maybe during marriage, because whenever it comes to that, gifting inheritance, that's considered separate property. But let's say the couples get married, but they commingled it and now is no longer. What should you do if you do get any kind of gifts that's like of value or inheritance?
Mhm.
If there's
I
no
mean,
place for
the same
prenuptial.
thing that I said earlier. You just want to make sure that remains separate from your community property, that you're not using it as a couple, that you're very clear, that this is in this separate account. It's my name, it's labeled. I'm not using it for anything with the household. I know that sounds a little, funny, but you just want to try to be as compartmentalized as possible. And I know a lot of people don't like thinking of it that way. But even if, say, for instance, that you decided that you wanted to take your money, $5,000, and you want to purchase something for the home, I'm not saying that you can't do it. Don't purchase it from that account. You could transfer it or something like that and label it, but just make sure that you're not allowing your spouse to come in and take money out. You're not having your spouse on that particular inheritance, because if that's the case, then you can't have it both ways. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I totally agree. One of the other things that I kind of want to ask your opinion on is like, when it comes to protecting the gifting or inheritance or anything that you brought in prior to marriage. I know we talked about how Texas is a community state. So everything that is acquired during the marriage is split. Let's just say a husband has a company. Okay. Before he gets married, but then he gets married and then the value of the company builds because his spouse is there to help him. What should you do to determine that? What is that considered separate property because he brought it in before?
I wouldn't want to go too deeply into that because that gets very complicated. And so what I will say is that when you have a person who's an entrepreneur, or someone who has a business, of any kind, or even if you are connected to a business, but you may not be working in it, but you're an investor, those are all situations where person should consider, like I said, pre or postnuptial agreement. So even if you're already married, you still have a second bite at the apple. And that's what I meant, when I said it may be that you're working with your spouse or you're working with someone else, but the business is, increasing, you have more profits, then that's the time that you need to make sure that you talk to whoever it is that you're married to or going to be married to about those types of documents, as a way to, as much as you can, ensure that you're not going to have a situation in the end where someone is claiming that they spent their time, toil, and talent to assist you, and that's why your numbers are the way that they are.
And I agree with you, but I think a lot of times, like the thing of the prenuptial and postnuptial, it's been around forever. No, I don't want to say forever. It's been around for a long time, but still people are barely starting to buy, actually consider it. So I still see.
I wouldn't say that though. I wouldn't say that. The persons, I've seen an uptick in persons who are and who are able to have the conversations intelligently, because they are evenly yoked. They do have similar, status, or even if a person has a little bit more materialistically, they're pretty much evenly yoked. We're talking about things that people can do. So this is the point, we're educating people on things that they should do. So this is, the perfect opportunity to do that.
So then what happens if that doesn't happen, where there's no prenuptial, no postnuptial, one person is taking care, where they're helping their spouse grow the business, not necessarily within the business directly, but outside the business, so that way it can grow. So then, like I said before, my question goes back, without going in too deep, is there other expertise that we should bring in that should consider, to kind of see like what's separate, what's community, or do we just go ahead and say, okay, it was prior to marriage, it's separate?
I'm not sure what you're asking, but what I'll try to, give you a little bit more insight as to how that usually works. If you have a situation where you have one person who's working, even if it's not on payroll, and okay, so you want to know what you can do in order to make sure that those things don't happen. Don't have your spouse working in your business as an employee. Don't have your spouse working outside of your business doing your books and things like that if you're not intending on them to be a part of that growth and to ask you maybe for some type of a reimbursement later on. So also you can think about what your business structure is. If you do decide that you want to put a person on payroll, that's a lot different than them working on the business and they don't have a salary or anything, but then you can see your numbers go up, or, whatever kind of business that you have. You do then have a situation where a person can come in and say, well, I have expended my time, toil, and talent. That's what we call it in the code. And because of that, I do believe that I deserve a certain portion of the profits. That's usually what you're going to get. Okay. They're not going to necessarily get your business, especially if it's so closely connected to your identity. And that's why I said we don't have enough time to go into all of that, because there's so many things that are connected to a person and their business, whether or not it's separate. A lot of times it's not about the classification. You can have separate property and the court will say, no, that's your separate property. That business is yours. However, This person expended time, toil, and talent, and they have provided us with the evidence to show that. So they are entitled to a certain percentage of your profits. So that's what could happen. But
That's what I'm
in order to
into.
prevent that, then we want to look at those things like postnuptial and prenuptial agreements to try to, make sure that those things don't happen, because within that document, you can say, your company is ABC Inc. You can say that this person agrees that they don't have any interest in this company, no interest in profits, nothing. You can explain that beforehand or after if you're already married.
So I guess and we won't get into it, but I guess the question I was asking you is like, let's say it's a spouse, it's a couple. The spouse is a stay-at-home to take care of the children. So they're not directly involved in the business, but they're making sure they take care of the needs. So
that's something different. That has to do with the household and not necessarily the business. That's a decision that was made. Now, what will happen as it relates to the stay-at-home mom, how that happens is not necessarily connected to the business. It's really about, okay, this person was a stay-at-home mom or dad. They didn't earn money. They depended on, this person. And then we talk about spousal support, maybe because we don't have alimony. That's why I said that's something separate. That's going down a different road. It's not going to be connected to the business profits, but it would be connected in a way where you're saying, okay, I didn't earn a salary this entire time, this 15 years. And because of that, I need some additional time. So I need this person to pay X amount of bills. I'm asking that happen for 5 years. And it really depends on how long you're married, whether or not you both have the ability to make the same amount, whether you have the same education. So, that's a different kind of category.
Absolutely. I guess to me, it ties together, but I can see where you're going with it.
Yeah, it's a little different. It's two different sides of the spectrum in that it's
but
not.
Then, in a way, it makes things, to me, unfair in the sense that, okay, well, if I decide to support my significant other and help him or her build her business by stepping down and taking care of the other obligations, you know what I mean? So I feel like if that's the case, then whenever
Yes,
things
I get it. It's a personal thing, and but
how do the courts dictate from
But
there?
Yeah, but that's why I tell people you have to think about the decisions that you make.
Thank you. That's what I need you to reiterate and say it loud.
Exactly. So if you decide ever that you want to be a stay-at-home parent, I say parent because it's not always a mom these days. It could be somebody non-binary as well. But if they make that decision, then that's why it's so important for couples to discuss what that looks like. And not just what it looks like during the marriage, but what it's going to look like should the marriage not work out. And I understand that those are tough conversations to have, but they are necessary. And that's why I said the ability to or not to have those conversations, that is what people should be looking at.
Absolutely. That's what I wanted you to reiterate, because, you can make that decision, but what does that decision look like? So you can't, you've been in this industry, you've seen all sorts, when it comes to that. So that's why I wanted to, and we're trying to educate our audience. That's the reason why I'm asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, great information, everything you discuss. All this is really, really great info. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that we covered, a lot, as far as ways that people can hopefully address these issues before it becomes an issue. But, if not, then you make sure that you seek legal representation, because it's important to strategize. If you didn't do it, if you didn't know, because a lot of people were married a long time ago, these conversations they didn't have. And Absolutely. So now you're in a situation where it has been 20 years, it has been 25, 30, 15. So then that's why strategizing, sometimes amicability when it's necessary or when it's possible, but if not, then just a really good litigation attorney.
Absolutely. So the biggest takeaway I took was prenup. No, I'm just kidding. No, of course. Thank you so much for tuning in with us on Divorce is Not a Bad Word, episode 4. If you missed it, no worries. The link to the stream will be in my bio so you can listen to it at your own pace. Again, if you know anyone who's either contemplating divorce or currently going through a divorce, please send this stream to them. Nikita and I are always here to provide valuable resources to anyone who needs it. Our next episode would be on Wednesday, July 19th. So mark your calendars. And if you guys have any questions that we did not answer on this episode, please send all your questions to divorceisnotabadword@gmail.com. And that is it, guys.